The manila envelope landed on Thomas Morgan's desk with a soft thud, barely disturbing the organized chaos of case files and coffee-stained notes. Sarah Chen, his secretary of 5 years, stood in the doorway of his small detective agency, her expression carrying that particular mix of concern and curiosity he'd come to recognize when unusual cases crossed their threshold. "The client insists on complete discretion," she said, her voice low despite the empty waiting room behind her. "And they're offering double your usual rate." Thomas leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. 20 years as a private investigator had taught him that cases with too much money attached often came with complications that no amount of cash could justify. But rent was due, and the agency's recent string of routine surveillance jobs hadn't exactly filled their coffers. "What's the story?" he asked, reaching for the envelope. "Missing person. Richard Blackwood, successful real estate developer. Disappeared 3 weeks ago without a trace. His business partners want him found quietly, no police involvement." Thomas's hand froze midway to the envelope, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. Richard Blackwood. A name he hadn't heard in 15 years, not since that night when his father came home, face ashen, hands trembling, speaking in whispers with his mother in the kitchen while teenage Thomas pretended to sleep on the couch. "Thomas?" Sarah's voice cut through his memories. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He forced himself to pick up the envelope, keeping his expression neutral. "Just remembered something I need to check." "Thanks, Sarah. I'll look this over." Once alone, Thomas spread the contents across his desk. Richard Blackwood's face stared up at him from a recent photograph, older now, silver threading through his dark hair, but still wearing that same confident smile that had once charmed investors out of millions. The smile that had convinced Thomas's father, James Morgan, to invest their family's entire savings in a development project that turned out to be nothing but smoke and mirrors. The case file was thorough: Blackwood's last known movements, his recent business dealings, personal relationships. His current business partners, Maxwell Holdings, wanted him found within the month. They cited urgent business matters requiring his signature, but Thomas knew enough about corporate politics to sense there was more to the story. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. One quick email to Maxwell Holdings declining the case, that would be the sensible choice. But something nagged at him, a persistent whisper of intuition that had saved his life more than once in this business. The phone on his desk rang, displaying a number he hadn't seen in months. His father. "Tommy?" James Morgan's voice sounded older than Thomas remembered. "We need to talk. I just got a call about Richard Blackwood." Thomas closed his eyes, memories flooding back, his mother crying over bills, his college fund emptied, his father's slow descent into depression after the scandal. The weight of those years pressed down on him, along with a new, unsettling question: how did his father already know about a confidential missing persons case? "Can't talk right now, Dad," he replied, studying Blackwood's photo more intently. "I'm in the middle of something." "Tommy, please. There are things you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago about what really happened with Richard." A text message flashed on Thomas's phone, an address in the warehouse district, sent from an unknown number, followed by 2 words that made his blood run cold: "Find him." Sarah appeared in the doorway again, her face pale. "Thomas? There's someone here from Maxwell Holdings. They say it's urgent." In that moment, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He reached for his jacket, already knowing he was stepping onto a path that would force him to confront not just the ghosts of his family's past, but the dangerous secrets that had been buried for 15 years. "Tell them I'll take the case," he said, sliding Blackwood's photo into his pocket. "And Sarah? Clear my schedule for the next month. Something tells me this is going to be complicated." As he headed for the door, his father's words echoed in his mind, along with a growing certainty that finding Richard Blackwood might answer questions he'd never dared to ask, if the truth didn't destroy what was left of his family first. The warehouse district stretched before Thomas like a graveyard of broken dreams, its abandoned buildings casting long shadows in the fading afternoon light. He parked his car a block away from the address he'd received, his investigator's instincts screaming caution. The text message felt too convenient, too perfectly timed with his father's call. Inside his car, he pulled out his phone and played the voicemail his father had left while he was driving. "Tommy, please. Richard wasn't who you think he was. What happened to our family? There's more to that story. Call me back. Please, son." His father's voice carried an edge of desperation he'd never heard before. The last time they'd really talked was 3 years ago, at his mother's funeral. Even then, the weight of unspoken words had hung between them like a wall. His mother had been the bridge, always trying to heal the rift that the Blackwood scandal had created. Without her, father and son had drifted further apart, each nursing their own version of the past. Thomas checked his gun, more out of habit than expectation of trouble. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows staring down at him like empty eyes. The door was unlocked, never a good sign in his line of work. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating islands of light in the darkness. His footsteps echoed off concrete walls as he moved deeper into the building, following a trail of recent footprints in the dust. They led him to a small office in the back. The door was ajar, and on the desk sat a single manila envelope, identical to the one Sarah had given him earlier. His heart pounding, Thomas approached carefully, scanning for any signs of surveillance or traps. The envelope contained a single photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed his father and Richard Blackwood, taken just 2 weeks ago according to the timestamp. They were arguing outside a cafe Thomas recognized, just 3 blocks from his office. His father's face was contorted with anger, his finger jabbing at Blackwood's chest. "I see you got my message." Thomas spun around, drawing his gun in one fluid motion. A woman stepped out of the shadows, her hands raised slightly. She was in her 50s, elegant despite the setting, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that held both intelligence and pain. "Elena Blackwood," she said softly. "Richard's wife. Though I suspect you already knew that." Thomas kept his gun trained on her, mind racing. Elena Blackwood had been a footnote in the original scandal, the loyal wife standing by her husband even as their world crumbled. But something in her eyes now spoke of years of buried truths. "Why the cloak and dagger routine?" he asked, not lowering his weapon. "If you wanted to talk, you could have come to my office. Because what I have to tell you could get us both killed." She reached slowly into her purse and withdrew another envelope. This is what Richard was working on before he disappeared. He knew they were coming for him, but he thought he had more time. "Who's they?" "The same people who destroyed your father 15 years ago. The same people who are probably watching us right now." She placed the envelope on the desk. "Richard wasn't the villain in that story, Thomas. He was a whistleblower who got in too deep. Your father wasn't his victim, he was his partner in exposing something much bigger." Thomas's hand wavered slightly on his gun. "You're lying. My father lost everything because of your husband's schemes." "No," Elena's voice cracked with emotion. "Your father lost everything because he and Richard tried to expose corruption that went all the way to City Hall. The real estate scandal was a cover-up, designed to discredit them both before they could go public." A sound echoed from somewhere in the warehouse, footsteps, multiple sets. Elena's face went pale. "They're here," she whispered. "Take the envelope. Find Richard." "But Thomas." She met his eyes with an intensity that chilled him. "Don't trust anyone. Not Maxwell Holdings, not the police, and especially not your father. Not until you know the whole truth." The footsteps grew closer. Elena melted back into the shadows, leaving Thomas alone with the envelope and a head spinning with questions. As he searched for another exit, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, 911. Your father just came to the office. He says Richard Blackwood is dead. Through a broken window, Thomas caught a glimpse of men in dark suits entering the warehouse. He tucked the envelope into his jacket, knowing that his next move could either unravel a 15-year-old conspiracy or make him its next victim. The fluorescent lights in Thomas's office buzzed like angry wasps as he faced his father across the desk. James Morgan had aged decades since Thomas had last seen him, grief and secrets etching deep lines around his eyes. The envelope from Elena Blackwood weighed heavy in Thomas's drawer, its contents still unopened. Richard reached out to me 3 months ago, James said, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a paper coffee cup. He said he had proof, evidence that would clear both our names. I didn't believe him at first. After everything, how could I? Thomas studied his father's face, searching for traces of the man who had once taught him to ride a bike, who had worked 2 jobs to save for his college fund before Blackwood destroyed everything. The betrayal had transformed James Morgan from a pillar of strength into a shadow, and watching it happen had shaped Thomas's own path in life, his need to uncover truth, to prevent others from suffering similar fates. Why didn't you tell me he contacted you? Thomas kept his voice steady, professional, though his heart ached with 15 years of unspoken pain. Would you have believed me? James met his son's eyes. You made your feelings clear at your mother's funeral. Said I was living in the past, unable to move on. But Tommy. His voice cracked. What if I was right all along? What if your mother died believing I was a fool when actually? The words hung in the air between them. Thomas remembered his mother's final days, how she had called them both to her hospital room, pleading for reconciliation. Life's too short for carrying old hurts, she had whispered. But some hurts ran too deep, shaped too much of who they had become. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face grave. Thomas? The medical examiner's office just called. They want you to identify a body. The drive to the morgue passed in a blur of neon signs and rain-slicked streets. Thomas had insisted on going alone, leaving his father pacing in the office. Every traffic light seemed to pulse with the rhythm of unanswered questions. Why had Blackwood resurfaced now? What was in Elena's envelope? And most haunting of all, what if his father had been innocent all these years? The morgue attendant, a tired-looking man named Rodriguez, led Thomas down a sterile hallway. Found him in the river this morning, he explained, pulling out the drawer. No ID, but matches the description you provided. Thomas steeled himself, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight. The body on the slab wore Richard Blackwood's face, but something was wrong. The hands were too smooth for a man his age, the slight scar above his right eyebrow, visible in every photo Thomas had studied, was missing. This isn't him, Thomas said, certainty flooding his veins. Similar build, similar features, but it's not Richard Blackwood. Rodriguez frowned, checking his paperwork. The anonymous tip was very specific about the identity. Anonymous tip. Thomas's investigator instincts flared. When exactly did this come in? About an hour after your office reported him missing to us. Thomas's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, smart boy. Now you're asking the right questions. Check the envelope. Back in his car, Thomas finally opened Elena's envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note, the truth about Project Lighthouse. RB. The USB drive contained a single video file. Thomas plugged it into his laptop, heart pounding. Richard Blackwood's face filled the screen, looking haunted but very much alive. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 3 days ago. Thomas, if you're watching this, then they've made their move. The body they found isn't me, it's a warning. 15 years ago, your father and I discovered something in the city's development contracts, something that went beyond simple corruption. We tried to expose it, but they were too powerful. They destroyed us both to keep it quiet. But now, Blackwood leaned closer to the camera, his eyes intense. Now we have proof. Your father doesn't know the whole story yet. I kept him in the dark to protect him. The real evidence is hidden in the old Lighthouse Point development site. Find it, but be careful. They'll be watching. Trust Elena, she knows more than she's told you. And Thomas. I'm sorry. For everything your family suffered. We thought we were doing the right thing, but we underestimated how far they would go to keep their secrets. The video ended, leaving Thomas sitting in the dark parking lot of the morgue, reality shifting beneath his feet. His phone rang, his father again. Tommy? Are you there? I remember something about Lighthouse Point. Something Richard told me the night before everything fell apart. We need to talk. Thomas stared at the phone, Elena's warning echoing in his mind, don't trust anyone, especially not your father. But as rain drummed on his car roof, he realized he had already crossed a point of no return. The only way forward was through the heart of a mystery that had shaped his entire adult life, even if the truth shattered everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and justice. Lighthouse Point loomed against the evening sky, its abandoned construction site a monument to broken dreams and buried secrets. Thomas sat in his car, watching raindrops trace patterns on the windshield while his father's words echoed in his mind from their earlier conversation. The night everything fell apart, James had said, his voice heavy with memory, Richard came to our house. Your mother was visiting her sister, and you were at college. He was terrified, Tommy. Said he'd found something in the development contracts that went beyond money laundering. Something about missing people. The site's security fence had long since rusted through, creating gaps large enough for Thomas to slip through. His flashlight beam caught the skeletal remains of what should have been luxury condominiums, now just concrete foundations reclaimed by weeds and weather. As he moved deeper into the site, memories surfaced like old wounds. The Christmas after the scandal, when they couldn't afford presents. His mother taking an extra cleaning job, insisting she enjoyed the work while hiding her exhaustion. His father, once proud and confident, sitting silent for hours in his study, staring at old photographs. A sound made him freeze, footsteps on gravel, too deliberate to be random. Thomas killed his flashlight, pressing himself against a concrete pillar. In the darkness, a beam of light swept past, accompanied by voices. The old man's kid is here, a man said quietly. Boss wants us to send a message. Thomas held his breath, years of investigative work taking over. 2 sets of footsteps, both male, one favoring his left leg. Armed, based on the distinctive sound of holsters against fabric. Remember, rough him up, but nothing permanent. We need him functional for what's coming. Thomas reached for his phone, fingers finding Sarah's speed dial by memory. One press would bring help, but it would also mean explaining everything to the police. Before he could decide, a third voice spoke from the shadows, sending ice through his veins. Hello, Tommy. Detective Marcus Chen stepped into view, his police badge catching what little light remained. Thomas's longtime contact on the force, his friend for over a decade, the man who'd helped him start his agency. Marcus? Thomas's voice cracked with disbelief. You're part of this? Part of it? Marcus laughed softly. I've been managing it since before you got your PI license. Did you really think it was coincidence that so many of your early cases came through my recommendations? The betrayal hit Thomas like a physical blow. Marcus had been at his mother's funeral, had helped him through the darkest days after her passing. They'd shared countless dinners, celebrated case closures, trusted each other with their lives. Why? The question burned in Thomas's throat. What could be worth all this? Your father and Blackwood stumbled onto something they couldn't understand, Marcus said, moving closer. Something bigger than corrupt real estate deals or laundered money. Something that keeps this city running. We gave them a chance to walk away. James was smart enough to stay quiet after we took everything from him. But Richard. He shook his head. Richard never could let go. Thomas's mind raced. The USB drive from Elena was still in his car. If he could get to it, get the evidence to someone he trusted, but who was left to trust? You don't have to follow your father's path, Tommy, Marcus continued, his voice almost gentle. There's a place for you in this. Your skills, your connections, we could use someone like you. Like you used my father. Anger rose in Thomas's chest, hot and clarifying. Like you're using Elena Blackwood. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Elena? When did you? He turned sharply to his men. Find her. Now. The moment of distraction was all Thomas needed. He launched himself sideways, rolling behind a pile of construction debris as bullets sparked against concrete. Running on instinct, he zigzagged between pillars, Marcus's shouts fading behind him. His phone buzzed as he ran, a text from an unknown number, West Entrance. Black SUV. Now. Thomas rounded the corner and saw it, a vehicle idling in the shadows, its driver hidden behind tinted glass. Every instinct screamed trap, but the sound of pursuit left him no choice. He yanked open the passenger door, diving inside as more shots rang out. The driver accelerated before he could even close the door properly. In the dashboard lights, he saw Elena Blackwood's face, set with grim determination. Richard said you'd figure it out eventually, she said, taking a sharp turn onto the main road. He just hoped it wouldn't cost you everything like it did your father. Thomas looked back at the receding construction site, at 15 years of lies crumbling like its abandoned foundations. His phone lit up with a message from his father, "Son, I know where Richard is. Real this time. But we need to move fast." Elena saw the message. Your father's part of this isn't over, Thomas. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth about what really happened that night? About what your mother knew? Thomas stared at her, rain drumming on the SUV's roof like a countdown. What do you mean, what my mother knew? She's the one who helped Richard disappear, Elena said quietly. She's the reason he's still alive. Rain drummed against the windows of Elena's safe house, a modest apartment above a closed bookstore. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at his mother's diary, a simple blue notebook he'd never seen before. Elena had retrieved it from a safety deposit box that morning, along with a stack of carefully preserved letters. Your mother was extraordinary, Elena said softly, placing a cup of coffee before him. She built an entire underground network, right under their noses. While everyone thought she was working extra cleaning jobs, she was actually helping people disappear, people who knew too much, who'd seen too much. Thomas ran his fingers over his mother's familiar handwriting, each word revealing a woman he'd never truly known. The pages spoke of careful plans, of quiet courage, of a burden carried alone to protect those she loved. The night Richard came to your house, Elena continued, he brought evidence of human trafficking. Construction sites used to move people, development projects that were covers for something much darker. Your mother already knew, she'd been finding proof for months through her cleaning jobs at City Hall. She had access to offices after hours, saw documents she wasn't meant to see. Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the pages. All those nights she came home exhausted. I thought she was working herself to death because of what Blackwood did to us. She was saving lives, Thomas. The extra cleaning jobs were real, but they were her way in. She built a network of other cleaners, maintenance workers, people nobody notices. They became her eyes and ears. When Richard realized how deep the corruption went, she was the one who helped him vanish. A particular entry caught Thomas's eye, dated 3 days before his mother's death. James must never know. He carries enough guilt already. What matters is that Tommy is safe, building his own life. Sometimes love means protecting people from the truth until they're ready to bear it. The cancer diagnosis, Thomas said, his voice thick with realization. Was it real? Elena's silence was answer enough. Thomas stood abruptly, needing to move, to breathe. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of revised memory. They found out, he whispered. Didn't they? She knew they were closing in, Elena confirmed. The cancer story, it was her final act of protection. A natural death that wouldn't raise questions, wouldn't put you and your father in danger. She used her last months to ensure her network would continue, that the people she'd helped would stay safe. Thomas thought of his mother's final days in the hospital, how she'd insisted on having so many visitors, former cleaning colleagues, nurses, people he'd barely known. She was passing on information, he realized. Making sure her work would continue. Your mother understood something fundamental about power, Elena said. Real change often comes not from grand gestures, but from quiet acts of resistance. From people choosing to do what's right, day after day, even when no one sees. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Elena moved silently to a window, then relaxed slightly. It's Richard, she said. And, your father. The door opened to reveal Richard Blackwood, older and grayer than his photos, supporting James Morgan, who looked like he'd aged years and days. Blood stained James's shirt sleeve. They found me, James gasped. Marcus, he said, Mom's network is still active. Still threatening their operation. He said. He looked at Thomas, eyes filled with grief and pride. He said she died protecting something bigger than all of us. She did, Thomas said quietly, understanding finally settling over him like a mantle. And now we're going to finish what she started. Richard placed a hard drive on the table. Here's everything. Every document your mother collected, every piece of evidence I've gathered since disappearing. Dates, names, locations, enough to bring down their entire operation. It's not that simple, Elena warned. These people, they've shaped this city's politics for decades. They have judges, cops, politicians in their pocket. We'd need a way to release everything at once, something they couldn't cover up or explain away. Thomas looked at his mother's diary, at the network of quiet heroes she'd built. An idea began to form, dangerous, possibly foolish, but somehow right. Mom's network, he said. It's not just about helping people disappear, is it? It's about all the invisible people who keep this city running. The cleaners, maintenance workers, service staff, people who see everything but are never seen. Elena's eyes widened with understanding. A simultaneous release, she breathed. Through every member of the network. Hundreds of people, all sharing the evidence at once. While we take the hard evidence to the one person at the FBI Mom trusted, Thomas finished. He turned to his father, seeing not the broken man of his youth, but someone who'd carried the weight of an impossible choice for 15 years. Dad, are you ready to help me finish Mom's work? James Morgan straightened, something of his old strength returning to his bearing. Son, he said, I've been ready since the night I learned what your mother really died for. Thomas looked around the room, at Elena's quiet determination, Richard's weary resolve, his father's rekindled purpose. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving a clarity in the air that felt like promise. His mother had chosen to protect them from the truth until they were ready. Now, finally, they were. Dawn broke over the city like a whispered promise, painting the streets in shades of gold and shadow. Thomas stood at his mother's grave, placing fresh flowers against the marble headstone. The morning dew dampened his knees as he traced her name with gentle fingers, understanding at last the weight she had carried all those years. You would have been proud, Mom, he said softly. Your network, they were magnificent. Every single one of them. The events of the past week played through his mind like scenes from a dream. Hundreds of cleaning staff, maintenance workers, and service personnel had become unexpected warriors for justice, each sharing their piece of the truth through social media, community organizations, and trusted journalists. The evidence spread like wildfire, impossible to contain or discredit. Marcus Chen and his associates had tried to maintain control, but they'd fundamentally misunderstood the power of the invisible people who kept their world running. They couldn't threaten or silence an entire workforce that had already learned to protect each other, taught by Thomas's mother's quiet example. "Your mother believed in the ripple effect of small acts of courage," Elena had said, watching the news coverage of the arrests. "How one person's decision to do what's right could inspire others to find their own strength." The FBI investigation was still ongoing, but the foundation of corruption was crumbling. Judge appointments were being reviewed, political careers were ending, and most importantly, the trafficking networks were being dismantled, their victims finally finding safety through the same underground channels his mother had helped create. Thomas heard footsteps on the dewy grass behind him. His father approached slowly, respect in his careful movements. "I brought her favorite," James said, placing a small potted orchid beside Thomas's flowers. "She always said they were stubborn things, blooming despite everything, finding light in the darkest corners." They stood together in the morning silence, father and son, the weight of unspoken words finally lifting between them. James had spent the week sharing everything he knew with federal investigators, his testimony strengthened by years of carefully preserved documents, evidence his wife had helped him gather while pretending to be focused only on rebuilding their lives. "I didn't understand her," James admitted quietly. "All those years, I thought she was just surviving. Keeping her head down, accepting what life had dealt us. But she was fighting. Every single day, she was fighting. She was protecting us," Thomas replied, remembering the words in her diary. "All of us. Even Richard." Richard Blackwood had turned himself in the day after the evidence went public, his testimony adding another layer of verification to the mountain of proof. He would face consequences for his role in the original real estate fraud, but his cooperation and the revelation of his attempts to expose the larger conspiracy would be considered. "Your mother used to say that healing doesn't mean forgetting," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means learning to carry the truth in a way that makes you stronger." Thomas thought of Sarah, his faithful secretary, who had turned out to be one of his mother's most trusted allies. She had been protecting him all these years, watching over him while helping maintain the network his mother had built. The depth of loyalty and love surrounding him had been invisible until now, like stars hidden by city lights. "Dad," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. "There's something else. From Mom." He handed over a sealed envelope he'd found in the safety deposit box, marked with his father's name and the words, "When the truth is known." James's hands trembled as he opened it. A single photograph fell out, his wife in her hospital bed, smiling despite everything, holding up a small sign, "Love was always stronger than fear." "She knew," James whispered. "She knew we'd find our way back to the truth. Back to each other." The morning light strengthened, warming their shoulders as they stood together at the grave of the woman who had taught them both that real strength often comes disguised as ordinary love, that justice can wear the face of everyday courage, that healing is a path walked one step at a time, in the company of those who choose to walk beside you. Thomas placed his hand on his father's shoulder, feeling the tremors of grief and gratitude running through them both. In the distance, church bells began to ring, their sound carrying across the peaceful cemetery like a benediction. "Come on, Dad," he said gently. "Elena's waiting. We have work to do." As they walked away, Thomas glanced back one last time at his mother's grave. The orchid's delicate blooms caught the morning light, strong and beautiful against the stone. Like love. Like truth. Like the quiet courage that changes worlds, one invisible act of grace at a time.